Hey folks, Beth over there on the left, Cathe Ray, needle in a haystack there on the right. Yep. Thanks for joining us. Yay.
You're welcome.
I'm not muted,
How's
you're
life
not
at your
muted.
end of the world?
Hey, we're still alive. It was 70 degrees this morning and 40 degrees this afternoon. How's that?
Ooh,
Ooh,
Yeah, like a stone.
that's a
Yep.
pretty significant swing.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Uh,
Midwest in the fall.
yep. All right, Cathe is here to do some thread talking with us, and we're excited about it. Get out a pencil and paper now, because she's going to take you through different threads and what thread count they work best on. So you're going to want to make a few notes, because that question comes up all the time. So make a chart, make a something, because you're going to get some help tonight.
And
Sunday,
feel free to ask questions.
yes. Oh, please ask the questions. Yes.
Yeah.
Sunday, Cathe Andrews is our guest. Just recorded that yesterday. You definitely want to listen to it. Boy, that was a good discussion. I say that every time,
Yeah,
but
she
this
had a
was
lot to
really
say.
good. This one was really
She
good.
had a
Yeah.
lot. She had a lot of good stuff to say.
She
It was
was
good.
wound up. It was good. So catch that Sunday for sure. Now remember, next Wednesday, no show. Next Wednesday, no show. That's the night before Thanksgiving. I just learned that we're going to have the 6-year-old and the 4-year-old overnight. And then I'm getting up
Ooh.
early and taking them to a fun run, half-mile fun run, and then a parade. And it's supposed to be 29 degrees. I don't
Woo!
think I
Oh,
don't
what a
think I've
blast.
won. I do not think I've won here. No. Mm-mm.
Oh, it's a great grandpa activity. Come on.
Right. Okay. I'm right. Let me just get that written down here. Yeah. All right. Um, it's going to be interesting. Um, last week's winners of the Textured Treasure Charts, they're winging their way to you, or already have arrived. Sarah Sartori, Josie Matthias, Brenda Ehlers, and Zoriana Vikovanska. Vikovanska? I think that sounds pretty good. I'm going with that. So Sarah, Josie, Brenda, and Zoriana are all winners. If you don't have them, they'll be there in a day or two, because we sent them out Friday. Yep. So there's your winners. Um, that's all we got for announcements, because we want maximum time with Cathe. So, Cathe, have at it. Here, let me get some of this stuff
Okay.
off the screen here. Oh, let me put that back up, folks. Cathe does this out of the kindness of her heart and for the good of the cause. Support her, please. Needle in a haystack, needlestack.com. Yeah, she's got everything under the sun on that website. If you need it, she'll find it.
Yeah.
Yeah, please support Cathe. She puts some time, quite a bit of time in to do these things, and they're very helpful, and we appreciate it. So help her out. All right, that one's going away, so we have all the room. Cathe, I'm going to go to your tabletop,
Okay.
and it's all yours.
Okay. Thanks. So I'm actually not going to use everything out of my little bag tonight. This is actually from one of the previous sessions. But what I wanted to do was go through. Gary had said he thought it would be helpful to talk about what counts specific threads are good for, particularly for if you're doing counted work as opposed to some other kind of technique. So what I wanted to show you real quick is, and you should be able to see this on the screen in a sec, this is the thread list from the website. So if you go to needlestack.com, on the left-hand side where it says threads, this is not the online catalog itself. This is the list of all the threads that we carry. It's actually in printed version, like 3 pages. So it's a huge range of threads. And what I thought I would do just to make it simple would be go over this. So if you have the ability to just print those pages off the website, you can, or just take some notes and then you can print the pages later so that you can have some idea what it was I was talking about. So we do them, if you look on that page, they're broken down by the thread list in general, which is really by vendor. So Access Commodities, Anchor, DMC, Kreinik, etc. But the one that I tend to refer people to is this part of the list, which is threads and ribbons by type. So this way, here's all the silk ones that we carry. Now, keep in mind, we don't carry everything that's manufactured, but we do carry a lot of it. And if we don't carry it, I usually have some idea what the fiber content of it is. Um, and this can be helpful if you're looking for not just a particular look, but maybe you've got somebody who you want to give a gift to and they really want to stitch with something that's made out of soy. And yes, there is in fact a thread made out of soy. So I'm going to go down this list and talk a bit about what they're good for in terms of count. And some of this will be a mixture of needlepoint, some of it will be a mixture of cross stitch and just what the counts are. So the first one on my list for silks is Access Commodities Trebizond. And Trebizond is the twisted filament silk that they manufacture. It's this one. And it's really great for needlepoint 18 mesh. Now, you can do embroidery with it if you're using a really loose weave fabric. You can do cross stitch with it, but you need to do it on something like an 18 count linen, not an 18 count Aida, an 18 count linen. Because even though they're physically the same count, the holes in an 18 count linen are actually larger. And so that will work better for that. And I have talked about this in a previous episode, and also there's a YouTube video on the shop channel for how to disassemble Trebizond so that you can use it on finer counts. If you take it all the way down to 3 or 4 of the little bundles that are in there, you can actually stitch this on 40 count linen. So it's one of the very versatile threads because you can pull it apart. It is filament silk, so you just kind of want to be a little careful when you do that. And then Avera Soie, which we talk about many times, makes a whole range of things. The most common being Soie d'Alger, which is a 7-strand silk. That's probably their most versatile one because of the fact that you can use it on pretty much any count. And I have to find my skein in here because it's hiding in here somewhere. Sometimes you throw everything in the basket and then you wonder what in the world you did with it. Well, I'm going to go actually grab it because apparently I left it on my desk. And because it's a 7-strand, you can use either one or however many you need. So the nice thing about strand threads, whether they're cotton or whether they're silk, is that you can scale them to fit. So for Soie d'Alger, I would use a single strand of the 7
Cathe,
like
Cathe, can I interrupt you there? Can you move the basket out? Yeah, or hold it over the white there. So yeah, there we go.
Yeah, let me just move the basket and then I'll just lay the fabric there.
Because the black thread on black is.
Yeah, it's a little annoying. Yeah.
Yep.
There we go.
There we go. Okay.
Then at least you can see it a little bit better. So this works really well to scale just because of the fact that it is a stranded thread. The most versatile threads, whether it's cotton or silk or even some degree wool, are the ones that you can either take apart or combine. So if you're working on 14 count Aida, you can use silk. Not everybody thinks of using silk on Aida. We tend to think more of using cotton, but there's no reason why you can't use silk on Aida, particularly if you want to do it on one of the really nice linen Aidas. So if I were going to stitch with one strand, if I were going to stitch with this on, say, 11 count Aida, I would probably stitch with 3 strands of it. It will give you better coverage. If I only want to stitch with one strand, I can go all the way up to 40 count. I can push it to 45. Now, at 45 count, what happens is because these thread get kind of fluffy when you work with them, and that's pretty common with silks. So when you take one strand of this, maybe you can kind of see the set of the strands. When you take one strand of this and stitch with it, it opens. I refer to it as unfurling. So what happens with silk is because the way it's twisted and because of the fiber content, it will tend to kind of want to open like this, whereas cotton will tend to want to grab, and wool even more so because wool's essentially like Velcro. If you look at wool under a magnifier, you'll see all the little doodads that hook it together, which is why it works so well, which is why you can do things like felt it. Um, but the stranded silks, and the stranded cottons are really your most versatile thing because you can, as I said, scale them to fit. So if you wanted to do 12 strands of something, you could. There's no reason why you can't. You might not want to, only because it gets a little unruly at that point. But if you're going to do a single strand, 40 count works well. If you go up to 45, you might have to twist it a little bit to get it to hold its shape and to get it through effectively. I know a couple people who regularly use it on 50 count. I don't happen to be a fan of that, but that's because I like a more tightly twisted thread. Again, it's one of those things where you kind of play with it. But this gives you a lot of options. The DMC, the anchor, all of those things give you lots of options. The other
Okay.
thread of a Verissoise that's a stranded one is Soie de Paris, which I don't actually have in my basket. And it's a filament silk, and it's a little bit smoother than the Soie 100. It's a 4 strand. So for Soie de Paris, I would go up to, again, maybe 40 count. It's a tiny bit thinner than Soie d'Alger, but you could go to a very less dense fabric, like even a 20 count, if you wanted to use a lot of strands of it.
Cathe, when you say filament silk, what does that mean to us? What is it about the structure of that?
Well, there's two kinds of there's two methods for effectively putting silk together to make thread out of it. There's spun and there's filament. And the filament is made out of the longest possible strands of the filaments of silk. And the spun stuff is made out of shorter strands where they get sort of bundled and twisted together. So if you take a filament silk, like even the Trebizond, and you run your fingers down this, it's going to feel super smooth. Now, it's not to say stranded silk and the spun silk isn't going to have kind of that feel, but it's going to be very, very different. So this stuff has, it's a little more flyaway because the filament tends to make it a little more wiry. And the easiest way to tell what filament looks like is this is Soie Ovale, which is flat filament silk. This is what, like the kind of stuff they use in Chinese and Japanese embroidery, but this is a French version. So I'm going to see if I can untwist this just a little bit. So you can see all of those little bundles of thread there. Yeah, if you can do that up, Gary. So each one of these is made from long strands of silk. So it has a very different feel. It's much smoother, and it's harder to work with. That doesn't mean it's not a nice thread to work with. It's just harder to work with. My particular issue is I have really dry hands and really dry cuticles. So if I use filament silks, they tend to catch they tend to catch right on the edge of my nails. So I don't work with them as much as I do some other threads because of that. But if you're doing hand embroidery as opposed to counted work, or you're doing, say, stump work, and you want to have a really shiny thread that's going to give you a nice sheen and be somewhat flat, use the Ovale. If you want it to be more rounded, use the Soie de Paris, because it's going to be made from filament silk but twisted together. So Soie d'Alger is spun silk twisted together, and Soie de Paris is filament silk twisted together. And then Trebizond is filament silk twisted together, twisted together, twisted together. So this is sort of the uber version of, and not in the go find a ride sense. Yeah, so kind of fun stuff there. And then in the Verissoise stuff, where it's completely twisted and more twisted like a buttonhole thread. So buttonhole threads are actually named that because they were traditionally a little heavier. They were super tightly twisted, and they were things that you used for actually making buttonholes. They were a thing that you used to stitch around the outside edge of the buttonholes. The Soie Surfine and the Soie 103 are made similarly, different weights. the 100 or the one or the is the denier, and that's the measurement of how thick it is. So if you took a caliper to it and measured it in some, tiny fragments of a millimeter, if you looked it up on some industry standard thing, it would probably tell you what that meant in terms of what the denier is. The 3 in SWA 103 means that it's made up of 3 strands of the silk that are twisted together before they're spun.
No.
SWA surfine is a 130/2. So 130 being the denier, so it's 30% thinner than the SWA 100, and it's only made out of 2 strands that are twisted together. So if you take it and you try to take it apart, which is actually not easy to do, you really have to work at it. I usually have to cut it and then take tweezers to it to try to get it apart. You won't be able to see it with camera. So this is what we classify nowadays as really the super fine thread. So if you're a fan of, say, the 5260, which is what this stuff is, this is Legacy Sesame Seed, which is this 5260. This works really well because at 50 count and above, it helps if you have a really tightly twisted thread, and it helps if you have a thin, tightly twisted thread. Now, it doesn't have to be tightly twisted. So the equivalent of this in a hand-dyed thread is Tudor silk. Tudor silk is not twisted the same way, but the individual strand weight's the same. So for SWA 100, I would say you can easily go up to 45 count. I do over 1 on 40 count with SWA 100. That's my preferred thread.
Okay.
Now, if you want to do, I know Nicola Parkman likes to use SWA 100 on 56 count. I don't happen to like the look, but that's a personal preference thing. Jean uses
a quick question
Jean
about
Lee.
that. So
Yeah.
if you're doing, because I was wondering about that, if you could use the 100, would you use a bigger needle than you would use with a SWA surfine then? Like a
No,
slightly
I wouldn't.
larger size?
No,
So you still use a beading needle?
Yeah, you would still use a
Right.
beading needle, because if it
Okay.
were a thread that might come apart more, so if you were, say, stitching with SWA Oval, I would say definitely, because you're going to get more resistance from the fabric and it's going to pull more against the thread. But the SWA 103 and the SWA Surfine are both so tightly twisted that you probably, take a long piece, you and another person stand 3 feet apart, try to pull it, and you probably won't be able to break it. That would not be the case with a lot of other threads. At some point, there'd be enough tensile strength on her that it would actually, enough tension on it that it would actually, fray or snap or something. So it's not going to fray like a stranded silk will. And it's going to give you a better sheen because of the fact that it's so tightly twisted. But I happen to like the SWA Surfine for its sheen, because you can kind of see, even just in this photograph, this is a dark color and you can see that there's quite a bit of shine out of it that you don't necessarily get out of other tightly twisted threads. It's not a matte sheen at all. It's not as shiny as a filament silk. So in comparison, not as shiny as this, even though this is black. This will still show up fairly shiny. And some of that is the fact that because it's so tightly twisted, you have more surface area for the light to bounce off. So a lot of what we think of, kind of tangential to the discussion, a lot of what we think of as shine is not really so much the actual physical shininess, it's how our eyes perceive it. And the more surface area that you get, there's more light that bounces. And because this thing is so tightly twisted, that on the spool in particular, it's going to look way shinier than pretty much anything else, because it's got so many nooks and crannies. Kind of like, was that old commercial for the company that made the crumpets? And they always talked about nooks and crannies and how much butter you could put in them. So this is about, how much light can you bounce? How much light can you bounce off a thread? That might be an interesting contest. How much light can you bounce off a thread?
Yeah.
And so both the SWA Surfine and the SWA 100 have become really, really popular in counted thread work in cross stitch for the 40 count and up, in part because they hold their shape really well, they cover well, and it's you get a nice sheen out of it. 10 years ago, hardly anybody used it. 10
Mm,
years ago, hardly anybody knew it even existed.
yeah.
Swasserfine in particular. But, it's one of those things where we use it. Lots of people show their projects with it. This is a case of where social media, whether it's a thing like this, whether it's a YouTube video, whether it's something on FlossTube, somebody's blog, newsletter, whatever, people are sharing more pictures, more video of their work, and so other people are finding threads that they might not have ever known existed, in part because they have a wider audience of people who are who are using those kinds of threads, and that's really helpful. The other ones in the soie
You got
d'Alger or in this,
Cathe. Beth, did you have a question? If you're not, I do.
Well,
okay.
I was just going to comment that the Swasserfine is lovely to stitch with. So, but I don't have a question. Sorry.
Okay, that's all right. You don't have to apologize. That's okay. Cathe, those soie threads, for lack of a better way of classifying them, if you're doing, say, surface embroidery, can you use them pretty much interchangeably to get different thickness threads for effect? I mean,
Yeah,
are they all dyed essentially
yeah.
the same?
Well, it's going to depend on the particular thread in terms of which color families they go by.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look in our online in the shop's online catalog, I usually list which ones share families. So like SWA 100 and SWA Surfine share the same colors. Now they don't all come. SWA Surfine doesn't come in as many colors as SWA 100 does, but they share the same color spectrum. Soie Perlé or Swago Blends is a completely different color range. And part of that is because in the case of Avera Soie, those threads grew out of different uses. So like Soie Surfine is what the haute couture places in France use for finishing. So if they're doing, like, I believe the Hermes scarves people use the Soie Surfine to do the hand stitching of the scarves
Okay.
when they do hand stitching of the edges.
So Beth, you were right, because we were talking about this in the podcast today, and Beth thought she remembered that surfine was used in the garment industry, and then we were talking
Yeah,
about whether you could wash that because of that, whether you could actually wash surfine. Do you
yeah,
know?
you can.
Okay. Look at you,
Yeah,
Beth.
you can.
Look at Beth had it all
You can
together.
actually wash. You, you can actually wash quite a
Amazing, isn't
number
it?
of the silks. The ones you want the ones you want to be careful of are the hand dyed ones. And that's because you need to know whether or not the person who dyed them set the dyes and whether or not they recommend getting them wet. I would never throw anything silk in the washing machine just because there's too much agitation. But I've hand washed some of my silk pieces that were stitched with silk. And as long as my general rule of thumb for drying a piece of needlework or something stitched with thread is I usually want to be there the first couple of times I wash it. I want to be there when it dries because what will happen, particularly in, say, like a color like the black, there's a boatload of dye in this black thread to get it this color.
Yeah.
So if you take this and hand wash it and have it on not the creamy fabric but on this white fabric, there's a good chance that even though the dyes are set, which means they're color fast, it means the color won't change, but the excess dye molecules are going to want to go somewhere. And they will want to go to the thing closest to them, which is not the thread, it's the fabric. So the first 2 or 3 times I ever wash a piece, if I'm going to regularly launder it, I will take it and I will hand wash it, rinse it in warm or cold water, depending on what it is I'm working with. And then I roll it up in usually a white towel. And I use white because then I can see if any of the dye is going to run. I will squeeze the water out of it and then I'll stretch it out and I will actually iron it dry myself. I won't let it
Oh.
dry in the towel. And I do that because the point at which color will want to wick out of newly washed thread is when it still has moisture in it, but the fabric doesn't. So the fabric will dry first just because it's thinner. So particularly, like, let's say you're doing satin stitch. I have a piece that I did years ago, I don't know, probably more than 30 years ago, that I did with a hand dyed cotton. I had to wash it 4 times to get all the excess dye out.
Mm.
And because it was hardanger and it was cluster blocks, the thread was really thick. And so I had to rinse it numerous times to be able to get the excess dye molecules to find another home other than the fabric. And every time I would get close to the fabric was done, but this bundle of 5 or 6 stitches next to each other was not quite dry yet, then what would happen is this black would go, oh, I have excess dye to release. I think I'll send it over here into this white fabric. And, just needless to say, pissed me off. So if you are gonna wash something, um, uh, you can always rinse it first if it's not a thread that's going to have a problem doing that, meaning it's not going to become really flyaway. Or just know that when you're done with it, that you want to be there when it dries. So I turn it upside down into a terry cloth towel, always white, because then I can tell. And then I iron it from the backside, usually with a pressing cloth. So something that's almost as thin as this fabric, as the sesame seed. You can get them at, fabric stores, quilt shops, or you can make them out of handkerchief material. And then I check it as I'm ironing it to make sure, because I'll see the steam dissipate, and then I'll check it to make sure that the color from this hasn't wicked into here, because what I don't want to have happen is that it completely dries, and then if it looks like it's going to run, I go rinse it again. I might
Okay.
rinse it for 2 or 3 minutes. I might soak it for a little while. Like I said, with that one piece, I had to do it like 4 times. Took me probably close to 2 hours to get, but it was red and purple. And those are 2 notorious colors for having the dyers have to put a lot of dye into the formula. Red dye molecules are the biggest, so they will tend to release and find a home someplace. So just know when you do that, there's a reason for that.
Yeah.
There's the science behind dye, color, how big the molecules are, all of that is just really fascinating. That's like a whole other talk for somebody who's an expert in that.
Right.
But yeah, you can wash silk. I just always make sure, like I said, that I take care when I do it the first couple of times, so that I've made sure that it's not going to run. And then
Yeah.
after that, I will still wash it by hand, but I'm going to be a little bit less careful of it because I know it's not going to run at that point.
Right.
So, and then the other threads that are really so Veriswa mostly makes silk. They don't make just silk, but they mostly make silk. Is Swago Blends and Swa Perlé, and they're also twisted threads. They are ones where I should go grab them. They are ones where they would be useful. So Swa Perlé works on like 20 count. You could maybe kind of use it on 28. I think it might be a little bit too thick for that. But I think it would probably work okay. And then the Swago Blends is another one of the filament silks. So it is super, super shiny and super, super wiry. It's one of my favorite threads, and I also swear at it quite a bit. And
Thanks.
sometimes you use a thread because it's the right thing, and sometimes you just have stern talking to it. It never, of course, pays any attention to me. So this is the Swa Perlé. So this is like a thinner variant of the Trebizond, kind of in that ballpark. So this is what I would use this on would be, say, it's about the equivalent of 2.5 strands of silk, somewhere between 2 and 3. It's not quite as thick as 3. If you don't want to use a stranded silk because you don't want to have to use multiple strands, this works really nicely on like a 20 count or a 25 count. It actually works really nicely on 25 count. You can kind of use it on 28, but it gets a little bunchy. And by bunchy, I mean you end up with, it's so there's so much density in the shared holes that it kind of makes the whole thing a little bit puffy.
Hmm.
But some people really like that look. So it's another one of those, use it as a guideline, but if it works for you and you like it, who cares? There are no thread police, not that I have found. And if I had found them, I would make them go away because I don't really think that's a good thing. And I would try that. Um, this is the Soie de Paris that I talked about earlier. So this is the stranded filament, and it is just super, super shiny, which you can in fact actually see in this photograph.
Yes.
So that this is shiny because of the fact that it's a twisted filament silk. And then the Swago Blends is also made from filament silk. So it is also super, super shiny. So even though this is silk, it looks almost a bit like it's metallic. And that's just because of the way the light reflects off of it. This, like I said, is a really great thread. It's a little persnickety because it has a little bit, you can kind of tell when I unspool it, there's a little bit of a curvature to it. It doesn't lay flat.
Hmm.
It also, because it is so slick, I'm doing a whitework piece in teal that to get the right color, I ended up having to use one of them as Swago Blends. I don't normally work in a frame. I tend to work in hand. I have to work this piece in a frame because I need both hands when I'm doing the satin stitches in Swago Blends to be able to control it.
Oh, okay.
Because if you stitch it and then you go to stitch the next stitch and you let go, that first stitch is going to want to move a little. So
So
it takes a little bit more care. It takes a little more care to stitch with this.
so it kind of has a Kreinik behavior to it in that you got to manage it all the time.
Prettier and nicer than Kreinik, but similar in that regard.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so
And
what?
most of that's just because of the fact that it is twisted really tightly and it's filament silk. It's the combination of those two things.
Hmm.
Yeah, Beth.
So what would you stitch with on that? Like what count thread fabric would you use?
I
Sorry.
actually I would use this for the same thing I would use SWA 100 on. Now, it doesn't come
Okay.
as many colors as SWA 100 does, which is one of the reasons why a lot of people don't use it. And because it is a little more persnickety to work with, but you can go up to 40 count easily. You could probably do 45. I think 50 would be pushing it. I think it would just make it again a little bit too bunchy. But I think it would still work okay. I do embroidery with this because it's just a really nice thread. You get a really nice sheen. Satin stitches in this are just really lovely. Now, granted, they don't flatten out like they do with a stranded silk like Soie d'Alger,
Yeah.
but you get a much shinier look. And so it's a really pretty thread to work with. If you've never worked with Swago Blends, well, if you've never worked with any of the filament silks in particular, so the Soie de Paris, for finer counted work, so the Soie de Paris and the Swago Blends, I would try them because I think they're really nice threads to add to your arsenal. And not have them be, and it's not, I mean, granted it's silk, so it's going to be more expensive than something like cotton, but it could be something you use as something you make a feature in a piece rather than maybe that's what you stitch it all in. But
Well,
really pretty stuff.
A quick question. So let's
Hmm.
say you're working a sampler and you want to put satin stitch on like a 40 count, and you don't want to use strands of like the Soie d'Alger. Could you use the Goblin for that?
You could. It's going to be a little thin probably for doing the satin stitch on 40 count. It would still work better for cross stitch for 40 count.
Okay.
I think if I were going to do satin stitch on 40 count and I wanted it to be I wanted it to be shinier, I would use Soie de Paris. So, and the reason for that is because you get that sheen from the filament silk from the Swago Blends, like you have the Swago Blends, but because it's a stranded one, because it's not twisted quite as tightly as the Swago Blends is, it
Okay.
will lay better when you do the satin stitch. So what
Okay.
count and what stitch you do varies a lot with these threads as well. So like this makes really nice cross stitch, but I think it makes even nicer satin stitch if you're willing to and if I'm doing satin stitch with this, I usually do one strand. If I'm doing it on say like 40 count, I'm going to use one strand and do multiple passes to get them as close together. I have a hard time, it's just me personally. I have a hard time doing really nice satin stitches if I'm trying to use more than a couple of strands and then trying to get this stuff to lay side by side, because I'm kind of anal retentive about that. And I want my satin stitches to lay flat. I don't want them to be, so I don't want my satin stitches to be, might show up better on this. I don't want my satin stitches to look like this where it's really twisted.
Yeah.
I want it to look more like this where it's all flat. And that takes way more effort if you're stitching with multiple strands than if you make multiple passes. Granted, it takes a little bit longer, but it's way less stressful and way less annoying and usually way more accurate. So it's kind of one of the tricks you do that you use with any thread. It's like sometimes you find maybe doing a multiple passes of a stitch works better than trying to stitch with multiple strands. So just kind of a personal preference thing.
I'm taking out of this that it would really pay to simply buy a spool of each of these threads and to have them side by each so you could see how they behave and to stitch them on different fabric counts. And
Yeah.
it would be really
So
educational.
for the denser ones, for the denser fabrics, we actually sell a sampling pack. We sell 2 of them. At some point, I will get my act together and do the less dense packs that have the different threads in them. So sampling pack 1. Here, I'll lay this over here so you can see it. So sampling pack 1 has SWA 100, SWA Surfine, 45, 46 count Bristol, 55 count Kingston, the 5363 Legacy linen, and then the appropriate needles. So the colors of the fabric and the colors of the threads change, but the thread that's in there doesn't. So this is SWA Surfine and this is SWA 100. So this is the dense, this is Silk Sampling Pack 1 and it's the densest one. This is Silk Sampling Pack 2, which has Soie de Paris, Soie Gobelin, Soie d'Alger, 37 count, 40 count linen, and then the needles. So again, colors change, but the threads themselves don't. So you get 2 different kinds of filament silk. So you get the Gobelins and the Soie de Paris, and then you get the stranded Soie d'Alger. So if you want to work with a denser linen and maybe you haven't worked with that before, the sampling packs work nice for that because it gives you kind of a nice way to try them without necessarily having to decide specific colors.
And
So
those
that's an
packs
option.
are relatively inexpensive. What are they, $20 or so? What is it?
Yeah, the sampling pack 2, which has the Soie de Paris in it, is $20 to $50,
Yeah.
and the other one is $20. And it's got like 9x9 pieces of fabric in it. So they're useful. I mean, they're big enough to actually do something with. We don't include any designs in them because lots of people have, like, if you're wanting to play with stuff, what I recommend is that you, if you only like to do cross stitch, either just find some motifs out of a sampler, or I tend to use motifs out of like Quaker samplers. Because those work really nicely. Sometimes that's kind of a fun thing to play with. So
Yeah. Tudor.
yeah.
All right. This is a question that popped up here on the thing, and I wondered it too. Tudor silk, is that simply a brand, or is there some tie with silk with threads the way they were made in the Tudor period?
No, it's named because Anne, who owns Gloriana Threads, loved Queen Elizabeth I,
Oh, okay.
whose nickname was Gloriana. So she picks names that are related to QE1. And
Marketing.
so since it was Tudor times, no, not so much marketing, just really more about what she, she named things because they had some meaning for her.
Okay.
So it's just Tudor because she happens to like the Tudor times, and that was, it was kind of a fun thing to name it. Yes, they all got named really. She started with the 12-strand silk, which has no name. It's just 12-strand silk. So, and the other one, Floramel, is also a name from Tudor times.
Okay.
So yeah, and I actually got to name a thread,
Oh,
Luminescence, which is Gloriana's hand dyed SWA 103. Anne actually dyed the first colors for me because I ended up with a spool of SWA 100 and went, I really like this stuff. Can you dye it? And rather than have a thread named for me, I wanted to name the thread. And since it was very luminous, I asked if she would call it Luminescence. And so that's how it got its name.
oh,
Yeah,
you
kind
had,
of fun.
yeah, that's great.
Yeah, and the
Oh,
reason that happened was is that Anne actually used to work for me. Anne lived
Oh,
here in the Bay Area for a large chunk of her life, or at least a significant part of her adult life. And she worked for me. I don't know, for about 5 years. She started Gloriana while she worked for the shop. So,
hmm.
and Ada Hayden, who owns a needlepoint design company, she was my original shop manager, and she moved back east, and then now she's in Texas, and she used to work for me as well. So you find a lot of people who used to work in shops start companies related to what they're related to that
Hmm.
in many cases, because they find something they love and go, ooh, I wonder if I could do that.
Yeah.
And in many
yeah.
cases it turns out to be a very successful business.
Hmm.
um
Okay, we do have a
so
question
Tudor
here.
so mhm,
Are
mhm.
silk threads made with an S twist or a Z twist?
It depends on the thread. So if you go back to the one we did, not the previous one, but the one before that, the fiber talk I did, I actually talked about S and Z twists, and I talked about which ones were which. I don't remember now off the top of my head. It usually has a lot to do with the manufacturing where the company is. They're usually one particular twist if they're made in Europe, and they're usually the opposite if they're made in Southeast Asia or some other part of the world. But European ones tend to be, I forget now which one it is, because like I said, I don't have my notes handy from that. But if you go back and look at the previous fiber talks I've done, it wasn't the most recent one in what we did that in July. I think it might be the one in June, um, where I talked about which ones were which. And really what that affects is how it stitches for your hand. So if so, let's say you take a thread that's like swab, like, so this is swab perlé. I'd have to figure out which twist it is because I can't tell off the top. But sometimes I have to lay them out on a piece of paper and tape them and be able to untwist them. I'm right-handed, so trebizond always untwists for me. Most of us have a tendency to twist our needle when we pull it through when we pull it through either the canvas or the fabric. And because of that, we either over twist or under twist the thread. So if you're right-handed, you will over or under twist one set of threads, and if you're left-handed, you will do it the opposite, just because of whether it's S or Z twist. So if you find that you have a problem with a particular thread, chances are it's a different twist from what you normally use. And so you might either have to over twist or under twist, or find another thread that you like that gives you less problem. Yeah. It's just kind of a manufacturing thing. Doesn't really affect what they look like. Most of the time you would have to put them under magnifier, or usually what I do is I'll tape this to a piece of paper and then cut it, and then I will untwist the end of it and tape it down and look at it to see which way did I have to untwist it so that I know which one it is. But yeah, if you check one of the previous fiber talks, I actually talked about the S and the Z twists. Um, we aren't going to get through all of these tonight because we'll be here for several hours if we do. I'm going to try to get through at least the silks.
Okay.
So, Karen collection, hand dyes, Soie Cristal, and water lilies. Water lilies is the solid. Soie Cristal is the hand dyed. They're both 12-strand silks. They are originally made for the garment industry. So you find a lot of silk sweaters made out of 12-strand silk. You might not know that, but that's what a lot of them are made out of. Again, because it's a stranded thread, you can use it on pretty much most counts. So what I would recommend is that and so a single strand of them is the same. A single strand of soie cristal, NPI, um, Belle Soie, Gloriana, most of these, a single strand is pretty close to the same weight. It might be off slightly, but it's not off by enough that you'd ever notice the difference. So I would use this as a single strand on probably 32 to 36 count, 32 depending on what this design is. If I wanted a little sparser, I'd probably use one strand. If I wanted it denser, I'd use it on a 36 or a 40. At 45, these all get a little bit like the Soie d'Alger. These all get, they get a little looser as you stitch with them. So they tend to untwist a little, which is good in that they give good coverage, but it also means that it can make everything a little plumper. So for Soie Cristal, Water Lilies, Belle Soie, Dinky Dyes, they're silks. Gloriana's 12 strand. Their Gloriana's Floramel, which is hand dyed soie d'Alger, and needlepoint ink and thread gatherer, the silken colors. Those are all stranded silks between 6, 7, 8, or 12 ply. The individual strands are all about the same. So you can go from using a single strand on, say, 36, 40 count, 45 if you like it really plump, or you can use multiple strands all the way down to 18 count. You could use it also on Ada if you had a desire to do that, because you're just going to get a different look with it. But again, any of the stranded ones, regardless of who the manufacturer is or who the dyer is going to give you the most versatility in terms of what count they will work on, because they're a divisible or additive thread. Now, you can work Swaggle blends in multiple strands, but because it's a very round thread, that's the other thing I should talk about really briefly. So Soie 100, Soie Surfine, Swaggle blends, these are all really, really round threads. So if you took this and held this up so that you could see it rather than trying to show it in a camera, this thread is really round like my finger. If you take this thread, it's slightly round, but it flattens out. So it doesn't keep its shape as rounded. And it can either be a feature or a bug for either of them, depending on your point of view. So if you want satin stitches where they flatten out, you want a stranded silk that's not really round, which is what most of them are. Most of them tend to be border on the slightly flatter end of the scale. If you want to be able to do something where you want it to keep its shape and you want it really round, you want something like Swaggle Blends, Soie 100, or Soie Surfine. They will stay round and they don't really flatten out. So if you're doing a stitch where you want it to have more dimensionality to it, so let's say you're doing a layered stitch where you've got some base threads, then you're going to put more on top of it. If you want it to stand out the most, you want to stitch it with a thread that's going to stay round, because it's going to give you the most height, because it's not going to flatten out as much. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay.
When,
But
when you
any
say
of
that,
the,
when you say that kind of stuff,
Mhm.
my head just starts spinning in terms of if you're putting something together, the thought process you could go through to really refine the look in just by
Yep,
studying the different threads and how you can change the effect, round, flat, combination, whatever it might be. You could really,
yep, round, flat, thickness, matte versus shiny, how shiny, all of those things you can play with. I mean, we tend to think of, if you look at most cross stitch designs, whether they're contemporary or contemporary things of reproductions of old things, we tend to stick to one kind of thread. We don't tend to, in the cross stitch world, we don't tend to mix different kinds of threads. So you wouldn't necessarily find in a cross stitch design somebody who called for all of these threads,
yeah,
and they're all very different. Now you might have somebody who calls for maybe these two because they couldn't find the color between Soie Dolce or NPI or Splendor, which is Rainbow Galleries stranded silk, also a 12 strand. Um, those all give you a somewhat more similar look, they are more similar than dissimilar.
Hmm.
So there might be a difference in shininess, but they're all going to be about the same weight. So dimensionally, they're all going to be relatively in the same plane. When you start adding these other threads in, then you end up with the addition of thickness, height. Does it flatten out? How shiny is it? I mean, you can tell even from here, this is the Soie de Paris. This thing is really, really shiny.
Yeah.
This is Swago Blends. So these two are the filament silks, and that's why they're so shiny. And even though these two are silks that are twisted, they're not going to be as shiny because they're not from filament, they're from spun. So
Mm.
if you factor all those things in, you could create an interesting sort of different kind of sampler, a thread sampler, a stitch sampler of different looks based on which thread you used. So there's a lot more that you can do to play with a design than you think. Sometimes I think we kind of get used to the idea of a designer telling us what to do, which has its appeal when, you go home at the end of the day, it's been a busy day at work, or you're a stay-at-home working person or stay-at-home mom or dad, and you're like, my brain is fried, I just want to do X's. Well, okay, maybe you want to do X's, but you want something a little different. Change up one of the threads to a different kind, not just a different color, but a different kind. You can stay with the same color if you can find it, but it'll give you a different look. Then you might go, wow, I never knew I could make that stand out. I do that sometimes with motif samplers. I don't tend to stitch motif samplers in their entirety. I tend to grab components out of them. And I sometimes take them and I will stitch with the same color, but I might stitch the interior in one kind and the exterior in another kind, and it gives it a
Oh,
sort of weird, almost shading without it really being shading.
right. Yeah.
So yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, you can use all of those things to play with it. I mean, I think that's one of the lovely things about living in the 21st century is even, so I started stitching more than 60 years ago. I turned 66 last month. I started stitching when I was 6. I started cross stitching when I was in my late teens, early 20s, when the only thing available that I knew of was DMC floss.
Hmm.
So think about just how much has changed in those intervening years. Even in the 23 years I've had the shop, um, there's just so much more on the market now than what was available then. Some of that is not necessarily that the threads are new, it's more that they've been repurposed into hand embroidery when maybe they weren't. Swago Blends is a great thing. I mean, the Versoise's been making Swago Blends for probably 40 or 50 years for the haute couture industry. But it took spooling it into a different format and having people stitch with it to realize, oh, this is a really great counted thread embroidery thread as well. It's not just for haute couture.
Hmm.
So some of it is expand your, if you're willing to expand your mind and kind of go, gee, I wonder what happens if I stitch with that. Well, why not try it? I mean, you might want to just stitch it on a doodle cloth and not stitch it on your real piece, because you might find that you don't really like it, or you might find that you fall in love with it and go, oh, I want to do all of this component, all of these sections in it.
And I can
You were
see,
going to say something, Beth?
yeah, I was just thinking, I can see taking like, oh, some of the old crewel work pieces. And I've got to say,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not fond of wool, but using these silk threads, to redo the piece and give you a totally different look.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I have somebody who for many years has done hardinger pieces on silk gauze, and she doesn't actually cut them. She just does the hardinger on silk gauze because she
Hmm.
likes the look of the cluster blocks. And other people who do, I mean, Berlin wool work, which is a lot of, generally tends to be flower and animal motifs, and started out primarily in wool. A lot of that people do in silk. When Darlene Osteen did her 9-part Berlin woolwork sampler, she keyed it not only for Appleton, but she keyed it for silk as well. And NPI silks were dyed by NPI to match Appleton wools. That's a whole other story. Um, and even though they're slightly different because of the fact that the dyes take differently, they're pretty close. So you can take a lot of things that might have been keyed for, in this case, Appleton, and key them to NPI because it keeps that same Victorian muted palette,
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
which is a very different palette. I mean, palette is a whole other thing in all of this. Palette for the Aversois threads tends to be, as you can tell from this, tends to be brighter. Um, it tends to be more muted for the NPI, in part because of the matching the Appleton. Um, some of the other ones you get very different looks just depending on what the color imagination is of the person who created them. If you take, 4 dyers, put them in a room together, give them the exact same dyes, they will all four come up with completely different things because it's like a baker, which I'm a baker. You can give 5 bakers the same recipe, and even though baking is more exact than, say, cooking is, none of those will turn out identical
Mm-hmm.
because there's always some nuance in there. Oh, I think I'm going to, whip that butter just a bit more, or something. So it's about color sense. It's about a whole variety of things that go into it. So that's the other thing that plays in all of this, whether it's a silk or anything, is like if you're going to stitch on a 5363 fabric and you want a thin thread, you've got Tudor silk and soie surfine to play with. Well, those are different because they're different color palettes. One's hand dyed, one's not, but they come from two different mines of color. So you can use that as a feature. For a lot of things in stitching, my recommendation is try to find a way to turn it into a feature rather than a bug. You can tell I was a software engineer.
Yes, it comes through.
Because because many times, well, I think many times you pick up something and you go, oh, what am I going to do with this? I didn't really want to stitch it in black. Well, maybe find a way to use that to highlight something. Maybe you don't want to stitch the whole thing in black. Or you go to your stash and you realize, oh shoot, the only color of Soie de Paris I have is this pink, and I'm not really a huge pink fan. But you know what? It kind of works with that color of Soie surfine.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I can make that work.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at old samplers, a lot of times we think, well, why did primarily girls, but why did they pick those colors? Sometimes it was because that's what they had available to them. If they were living in an orphanage and somebody was giving them the threads, they weren't going to say,
Right.
oh, I don't want that shade of mauve. They're like, oh, thank you so much, sir. I will make it work because that's what you did. So I think if you're willing to step back a little, look at a piece and go, I wonder if I can make that work there. The answer might be yes. The answer still might be no, but sometimes it's worth asking the question.
Yeah, we get quite spoiled with
So
your
some
we get quite spoiled with your 3 pages of thread types. Yeah.
Yeah.
We do. Well, you get spoiled, and also the other problem is that I think sometimes those 3 pages of thread types make people indecisive about what to do as well. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's the other problem, is that you can look at it and go, oh my God, there's all these, oh my heavens, there's all those silk options. What am I going to pick?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, there's probably no right answer. There's probably no wrong answer. It depends on a large variety of factors. I mean, I have a lot of people who will send us an email and say, they found a sampler, they found a cross stitch piece, they found something. It was stitched in DMC. They want to stitch it in something else, but they don't know what. My first question is usually either, do you have a thread type you want? Not meaning brand, but are you after stranded silk? Or are you after something else? And what count are you going to stitch it on? Because
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
those factors, are things that make an effect in things. So that's why I think, for me personally, even though my favorite threads to stitch with are Soie Surfine and Soie 100, that the stranded silks in particular are your best bang for your buck
Mm-hmm.
because you get the most options out of it. You can stitch with 2 strands, you can stitch with 1, you can stitch with 6. I do needlepoint a lot with stranded silks because I can go up to 8 or 10 or 12 if I need to. I don't have to be stuck with just one strand. And so, you kind of have to think outside the box sometimes a little about that.
Yeah.
I do want to quickly get through the rest of the silks, and then and then I'm going to talk about the soy one, and then I think we will save the rest for a future one because it'll probably take me 3 to get through this list.
Okay.
Um, so, in the Gloriana list, in addition to her 12 strand silk floss and her Floramel, so Floramel Gloriana is hand dyed Avera soie d'Alger. If you ever buy, actually I'll go grab a couple. If you ever buy the same color in Gloriana 12 strand and in and in Floramel, you will notice that they don't look the same. And that's because of the way the dye takes. And that's just a function of the fact that you've got a bunch of different options for how the thread is going to absorb the 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 dye. And so what happens is with the soie d'Alger as the base, because it's a shinier thread. So these are both Bordeaux. They are slightly different dye lots, but even if they were the same dye lot, they would look different. So what you'll see is, I'll turn it this way. What you'll see is the Floramel is going to look a little shiny. It's probably hard to tell it in the picture, but this is going to show up shinier than this does. This is going to look more like a matte silk. This is going to look more like a shiny silk. The individual threads, you take this 12 strand apart, you take this 7 strand apart, the individual threads are going to be about the same weight. So you can stitch them the same. You can combine them however you need to. So you can go from, 25 count, 28 count, all the way up to 40 or 45 count if you're only going to stitch with one strand. But the effect is going to be slightly different because one is going to be more saturated. The Avera soie, the soie d'Alger threads absorb the dye much more saturated than the base thread of most of the other threads. That's just a function of, I think, the way Avera soie happens to manufacture their thread. They use a really great quality silk, and it shows in even when you hand dye it. So
Okay,
those are two other options for doing stranded threads that are slightly different.
okay, quick question. Do silk threads work well with specialty stitches, or does it depend on the particular thread?
I use them in specialty stitches all the time. Whether or not you're going to use an overdye or a solid color is really more the question. So if you're going to do something like, let's say, a Rhodes stitch, which is stacked layers of, you're going compass points and you're going to end up with this stacked thing at the end, depending on how you stitch it and how much color variation there is in a hand-dyed thread, it can look really pretty or it can look really awful. So that's kind of where a judgment call comes in. There are some hand-dyed threads that don't work well for some specialty stitches because there's too much color change in them. So if you're going to do a long row of something, you might find it doesn't work well. But I do specialty stitches all the time. I do a lot of my needlepoint with specialty stitches rather than just tent stitch. And I use silk, and I use hand-dyed, and I use solid threads all the time. I just sort of kind of know from looking at the thread. So like this is a good example. This is what I classify as a tone-on-tone thread. So you can kind of see in the photograph there's a little bit of a lighter section and then there's more that's kind of darker. That would work better for a specialty stitch than something like this thread where there's several colors in it. So that thread would be more problematic for a lot of specialty stitches, for some, not for all, because there's so much color variation in it. So it doesn't mean you can't use it, but you might need to use it on a stitch that so let's say you're doing a stitch, like even something as simple as this. This might work better in a color like this because it's a smaller thing. If you're going to do it in a larger area, so if you're going to do a stitch that covers, a bigger area, you might have more of an issue because you might find that the color change happens too much. So again, it's a question of, is it a feature or a bug? And it's very much in the eye of the beholder. So
Right,
yeah, you
right.
can certainly use silk for doing specialty stitches. You can use pretty much any thread for specialty stitches. It's going to be a function of the count of the fabric, um, more than anything. So if I were going to do, I tend to like to do a lot of my work on 36 and 40 count. I do work on denser counts than that, but at the end of the day, sometimes I don't want to have to turn the bright light on to be able to see it. At
Right.
40 count, at 40 count, I like doing specialty stitches with some of the over dyes, particularly like the luminescence, which is the hand dyed SWA 100, or even just doing it with the Floramel, because I can get a really nice look on that. And I would do it on 40 count. I would do it on stitches that are a little bigger area rather than really super small stitches. On 28 count, I would, you can do it, you can vary it quite a bit, because on 28 count, a stitch that's over 8 threads is going to physically be a lot larger than it is on a 40 count fabric. So again, it's one of those things where if you've got a hand dyed thread in your stash and you think, I wonder what happens if I go for it. Can't hurt, it's not
Right.
like anything bad's going to happen. I mean, like I said, I wouldn't put it necessarily in my finished piece unless I knew it was going to work. But I have like tons of little doodle cloths of things and I write notes on my stuff. I think I mentioned that on one of the previous ones. So like this one from last time, I actually write notes physically on my fabric for what I used.
Mm-hmm.
And then I keep those, because then I don't need a notebook.
Yep.
And I will sometimes cut them out and stick them in a notebook, but a lot of times I just keep the pieces of fabric because I got more stuff to doodle on it. So I think one of the things that happens, this is again sort of a tangential thing, is that American stitchers in particular, we've been fed a lot about how to stitch based on published charts, which tell us do this, do that, do A, do B, do C, use these threads, do it with this many strands, do it on this count. A lot of the countries, I refer to them as the Commonwealth countries, because a lot of the ones that come out of sort of the English style of stitching, I don't know if it's still this way today, but for certainly many, many years, you were taught how to use a thread, but not exactly what to do with it. So you have to think for yourself a bit more. And I think it makes those stitchers a bit more freer. Inspirations Magazine is a great way to look at this. So if you look inside an issue of Inspirations Magazine, a lot of their designers, and certainly a lot of the people they feature that are stitchers, Americans look at that and go, I don't know how they do that. And part of that is because they were taught a different method of stitching, which is basically a free-for-all. Now, if you're doing gold work, you're doing Jacobean, you're doing for English for the Royal School of Needlework, that's kind of a whole different thing. But it's definitely much more of a free-for-all when it comes to embroidery. Cross stitch is different. Yeah, even the English are extremely staid in their implementation of cross stitch. It's even way more staid than it is for people in the States. But I think if you kind of grew up in the Commonwealth idea of embroidery as an experimentation of needle and thread, then you're far more willing to give it a try. So I would challenge people, even if you're just think of yourself as a cross stitcher, try something different, whether that's a different color, a different thread. I've never done hand dyed before. Buy a small amount of something, buy a skein of something. You don't need to invest in having converted an entire chart to silk, or having converted an entire solid chart that called for solid threads into all hand dyed threads. Start small. Start with one thing and play with it and kind of see where it takes you. And you might find you really like it. You might find you still prefer working with whatever it was you were working with before, but it doesn't hurt to give it a try.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And I'm going to finish up with a couple and then we can go because it's already 10 after
Yes.
6. As you can tell, I can go on for a while about this. The other colors, the other threads Gloriana makes that are silks are Princess Pearl and Princess Pearl Petite. Now, those are literally, those are more like, say, Soie Perlée. They're actually silk pearls. The Princess Pearl Petite works best on, I would say, if you're doing linen, 20 to 25 count. 28, it might be a little bit thick. If you're doing satin stitches with it, it would probably be okay. It's really more useful, and so is the Princess Pearl, for people who are doing canvas work because it's a denser thread. So it's not; those are both not threads that you would use like 32 count and above. They're way too thick for that. But they are really pretty threads to work with. And then, she's got other things like the Duchess silk, which is a needlepoint thread. And then the Tudor silk, which is weight-wise, the equivalent of each strand of Tudor silk is the same weight as Soie Surfine, pretty close
Oh,
to it.
okay.
So if you want to stitch on 5363, the combination of Soie Surfine and Tudor silk from Gloriana is the way to go. One is hand dyed, obviously, one is not, but that will give you the most color options out there. So a lot of times people will ask me, well, can I convert, meaning me, can I convert a chart from SWA 100 to SWA Surfine? And the answer is most of the time no. And the reason is there's just not enough colors.
Yeah.
That will change over time as more people have decided they like stitching with SWA Surfine, which means that, Access Commodities, which is the U.S. distributor, and plays a really significant role in what colors Aversois dyes, that over time there will be more colors that get added to it. When I started bringing in Soie Surfine 12 years ago, 14 years ago, I forget how long ago now, it's been a long time, there were like, I think we had 8 colors.
Really?
And
That's
so it's
it? Oh
grown.
my.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Wow.
And we weren't sure. So Jean Lee at the Attic, Deb at Stitchville, Roz Vansel at Acorns and Threads, and then eventually Janine Cheney, who now owns Acorns and Threads. We started what we called the Society of Soie Surfine, and we did it as a subscription because we were honestly not sure how many people would want to stitch with such a fine thread.
Mm-hmm.
And we planned for a certain number of subscriptions. And when we published how many we were going to do, I think all 4 of us sold out of our planned subscriptions within a couple of days because
Wow.
people were like, "Oh, I want to try that." So we did that for about a year and had more colors that came in, and then eventually Anne at Gloriana dyed. She actually dyed colors for us, which is eventually where Tudor silk came from, because the Soie Surfine, while it's a lovely thread, is really, quite frankly, a pain in the ass to have to dye and package because it is a very tightly twisted thread. It's not a stranded thread. It doesn't work as well. And so that's why she ended up finding a thread that would give a similar weight. And that's where Tudor silk came from.
Hmm.
There was a we understood there was a market for the people who wanted a finer thread to do counted thread work with. Like a lot of things, you try it, people like it, and you go, oh, maybe we should do more of that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
fun stuff happens. Yeah.
Yep.
Um, and then the other silks, and then I'll finish up with those, is Planet Earth makes silk threads, well, dyes silk threads. Pepper Pot's their thicker one. It's a needlepoint thread. It's primarily for 18 mesh and 13 mesh. They do have a 6-ply and a single ply. The single ply silk floss is really still more of a needlepoint thread, really still more for an 18 mesh canvas. But their 6-ply is more similar to these kinds of stranded threads. So it's something that you could do probably up to about 36 count. It's a little bit thicker than these are. I don't think it would work as well on a 40 count, but it would work fine, I think, up to probably about a 32 or a 36. Now, Baroque silk, which is made by, well, actually, Chris Lewis Distributing is the current owner of the company called, the thread is really a part of what is called the Pure Palette. They make another thread besides that. The Baroque silk is really nice, and it's a stranded silk, and it's useful up to about 36. So say 28 to 36 for linen. Thread gatherer silken colors, same as Gloriana, any of the 12 strands. It's a 12 strand hand dyed silk, so it's a single strand of it is about the same weight as all the other stranded silks. So whether it's Soie d'Alger, NPI, hand dyed, Belle Soie, all of those things, those are all very similar in weight. And then the other 100% silk is Vineyard Silks. And theirs is a needlepoint thread only. It's really an 18 mesh. You can do it on 13, but it's really made for 18 mesh.
Mm-hmm.
So of the ones that are most useful for counted work on say 28 to 40 count and above, 28 to 40 count are the stranded silks.
Yep.
So, and then above that, then the things like Soie Surfine, Soie 100, Swago Blends, the Gloriana Tudor silk, those are really the things you want to look at if you're doing denser stuff.
All right.
And that's where I'm going to stop.
Okay.
Because I'm not even a quarter of the way through page 1.
Oh man.
Okay, can I ask a quick question? So let's say I was going to do French knots on 45 count linen, and I have 100/3.
Yeah.
That would probably be okay, right? It would.
Yeah, it'll work. It'll work fine. And in fact, it will hold its shape well because of the fact that the 103 is going to kind of, I don't want to say it's going to get stuck on itself, but it will hold its shape better. You could do French knots with the Swago blends, but because it's so slippery, you will find that you have to really hold where that thread is before you pull the needle through because it will want to go poof on you. It's kind of like a pop over in that sense. It will have sort of an explosion.
Pop
I mean,
over.
Swago Blends makes really nice French knots, but they're definitely a work to get them to happen. But yeah, the Soie 100 would do nice French knots. I do. Sometimes I will use 2 passes for a French knot if it's a thinner thread and I want a slightly wider one, or I'll use a colonial knot, which is the one where you make it with a figure 8. And that tends to flatten it out a tiny bit more than 2 stacks of a French knot.
Right.
So,
right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Fantastic. Yep.
I think I'm done with silk. We'll cover the silk wool blends, probably the wool, and who knows if we'll get to the cotton next time.
Okay, we'll try. Thanks a lot, Cathe.
The
Thanks
next
to everybody.
one we'll have more.
Thanks to everybody. Happy
Thanks,
Thanksgiving.
everybody.
All right, we're out. Bye.
See you next month. Bye.